They told me to leave the room. HR director stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, clipboard pressed against her chest like armor, and said, "You need to step out now." I could feel every set of eyes in that room burning into me, the father gripping the bedrail, the mother with her rosary twisted around her fingers, the daughter translating my silence into something worse. The patient, Mr. Herrera's son, was barely conscious in the bed, oxygen mask fogging with every shallow breath. He had maybe days, maybe hours, and they wanted me gone. I opened my mouth to explain, to apologize, to do something, but the father stood up. He was a short man, weathered hands, the kind of face that carries decades of work in the sun. He looked straight at the HR director and said, in broken but clear English, "We trust her. Please keep her." That sentence cracked something open inside me that I'd kept locked for 2 years. The HR director's jaw tightened. She glanced at the attending physician, hovering near the monitors, then back at me. "This is a compliance issue," she said, voice clipped. "She's not a certified interpreter. Hospital policy is clear." The daughter stepped forward, younger than me, maybe 23, eyes red from crying. "She's the only one who understands us," she said. "The other interpreters, they just translate words. She translates what we mean." I wanted to tell them to stop defending me. Because the truth was, I didn't deserve it. 2 years ago, I made a choice that bent every rule in the book, and I knew it. I started interpreting without certification because I thought I could help. Because my own mother died in a hospital where no one spoke her language, where she nodded yes to procedures she didn't understand, where I was too young and too scared to fight for her. So when I got this job, medical records clerk, nothing fancy, I saw families like mine struggling, and I just started helping. A word here, a sentence there, then entire conversations, then entire care plans. No one stopped me. No one asked questions. Until someone did. The attending, Dr. Patel, cleared his throat. "Perhaps we can discuss this outside," he said, gesturing toward the hallway. The HR director shook her head. "There's nothing to discuss. Policy violation. She stays. We're liable. End of story." Mr. Herrera spoke then, in Spanish, his voice low and steady. I translated automatically, even though I shouldn't have. "He says his son asked for me," I said quietly. 3 days ago, before the morphine. He said, "Where's the girl who sounds like home?" That did it. The HR director's face flushed. "You're proving my point," she snapped. "You're not neutral. You're emotionally involved. That's exactly why we have certification requirements." She wasn't wrong. I was involved. Every family I helped, I saw my mother. Every scared kid translating for their parents, I saw myself at 16. Every time a doctor rushed through discharge instructions and a patient nodded blankly, I heard my mother's voice saying, "I don't understand, Mija, but I'll pretend I do." The mother started crying, soft and low, the kind of crying that's more exhaustion than anything else. The daughter put her arm around her. The father didn't move. He just kept staring at the HR director, waiting. Dr. Patel spoke again, carefully. "What if we bring in a certified interpreter and she shadows? For continuity." "No," the HR director said. "She's off this case. Effective immediately." I felt my throat close. I looked at the patient, tube snaking from his arms, chest rising and falling too slow. 28 years old. Liver failure. No transplant list because of immigration status. Family drove 16 hours from Tucson when they got the call. They'd been here 5 days, sleeping in chairs, eating vending machine food, trying to understand medical jargon through a rotating cast of phone interpreters who mispronounced their last name. I was the first person who got it right. The first person who knew what atoll was when the mother talked about what her son loved for breakfast. The first person who didn't flinch when they asked if they could bring a priest. The father reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to the HR director. "What is this?" she asked. "Letter," he said. "From other families. You want us to go, we go. But we go with her. You want us to stay, she stays." The HR director unfolded it. I couldn't see what it said, but I saw her face change. Just a flicker. Just enough. She folded it back up. "I'll need to escalate this," she said. "But for now," she suspended. "Pending investigation." "Investigation of what?" the daughter demanded. Of her helping us. Of her practicing medicine without a license. The HR director shot back. Of her violating patient safety protocols. Of her putting this hospital at risk. She turned to me. You're done here. Collect your things. HR will contact you. I nodded. My hands were shaking. I looked at the family one more time. The father met my eyes. Gracias, he said. Just that. The HR director left. Dr. Patel lingered. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I didn't report you, if that's what you're thinking. I believed him. He was one of the good ones. But someone had seen me in that room, or another room, or heard about me from someone else, and decided I was a problem. Maybe they were right. I walked out into the hallway, past the nurse's station where my coworkers pretended not to stare, past the elevator, down the back stairs to the locker room. My locker still had my name taped to it. Isabella Moreno. I opened it and stared at the picture I'd taped inside. My mother, smiling, holding a birthday cake she'd made from scratch. She died 3 months after that photo. I sat down on the bench and waited for my hands to stop shaking. They didn't. My phone buzzed. A text from a number I didn't recognize. They're asking for you again. Family won't sign the DNR without you. Dr. P. I stared at the screen. That was the choice, wasn't it? Go back and face whatever was coming. Or walk away and let them face it alone. Just like I did with my mother. The moment I was suspended, my whole world shifted. It wasn't just the official letter pinned to my locker that stung. It was the weight of being cut off from the people who needed me most. I kept reliving every moment with the Herreras, thinking about how much trust they had placed in me, how I had become their invisible lifeline. But I also thought about the risk I was taking, the crossing of lines that maybe shouldn't have been crossed. Looking back, I realized how I became more than just a supply clerk who spoke Spanish. It wasn't just proximity or a sense of duty, it was personal. Years ago, when I was 16, my older brother Carlos was diagnosed with leukemia. Mom didn't speak much English. Dad worked 2 jobs, and the hospital staff didn't speak Spanish. I was the only one who could piece together the confusing medical words and explain them to my family. But I was a kid, barely understanding myself. Carlos didn't make it, and I still carry that guilt every day, as if I could have done more. That guilt followed me into this hospital, pushing me to help every family struggling with language barriers. I thought I was paying a debt I owed, saving lives not unlike Carlos's, or at least making those final moments less lonely. But I never planned to become an unofficial interpreter, or to risk my own job for a job I wasn't qualified for. After the suspension, I spent hours scrolling through hospital policies online, trying to understand what I had violated. Certified medical interpreters undergo weeks, sometimes months of classroom training, learn medical jargon, and carry licenses. I had none of that. Yet, in the hallway between the pharmacy and the ICU, nurses would pull me aside to ask if I could translate for their patients, knowing the certified interpreters were booked solid or unreachable. My coworkers had mixed reactions. Some sympathized with me, whispering that the system was broken, that families needed care more than paperwork. Others looked away quickly, afraid of crossing the HR line. One day, Maria from housekeeping approached me. "You saved my cousin's life last month," she said quietly. No one else could explain what the doctors were saying. They wanted to send him home, but you helped him get the treatment he needed. I wanted to believe that with every story like hers, I was doing the right thing. But the shadow of Laura's warning loomed large. Behind closed doors, HR had begun formal investigations. I was asked to write statements, explain my actions, and submit to interviews with legal counsel. I wasn't just suspended. I was under scrutiny for where lines of responsibility should be drawn. There was talk of fines, maybe even lawsuits, if a mistranslation led to harm. But no one asked the Herreras what they wanted. The family wasn't just fighting cancer. They were fighting cultural erasure and exclusion. In immigrant communities, words carry more than meaning. They carry identity, trust, history. The certified interpreted, often strangers, didn't understand the nuances of the Herrera family's Spanish, their idioms, their fears. On the 4th day of my suspension, the Herreras called me. Mrs. Herrera's voice was shaky, her Spanish hesitant. Law interpret official, Elos no entienden a Miguel. No entienden lo que necesitamos. She said the certified interpreters tried, but it was like talking to a wall. David's brother's care was a mess, the doctors confused, explanations unclear. "Please come back," she begged. I wanted to stop time, to be there without consequence. But I was stuck in limbo. One night, I dreamed of Carlos again. I was back in that sterile hospital room from my childhood, holding his hand as machines beeped. But this time, I found the words to explain everything. To myself, to my family, to the doctors. I woke up crying with a new resolve. When the hospital pager lit up with distress news about Miguel's condition worsening, I couldn't ignore it. The Herreras wouldn't let me go. I wasn't officially allowed back on hospital grounds, yet they insisted I be the one to explain Miguel's MRI results. The only way their fear could soften was through a familiar voice. I was torn between obeying the rules and answering the call. I walked into the hospital late that night, sneaking past security, heart pounding. Miguel's condition was grave. Every second counted. I sat by his bedside, translating as best I could with the neurologist. The family clung to every word, their hope clinging to my broken voice across the language divide. But the reprisal was swift. Laura and 2 administrators cornered me in the hallway hours later. "You're insubordinate," she hissed. "This suspension is official. You are to leave immediately, or we'll call security." I felt their eyes on me, the cold machinery of a hospital that prioritized protocol over people. Still, the Herreras whispered among themselves and insisted, "We trust her. Please keep her." That phrase echoed in my mind like a battle cry. The investigation came fast and hard. HR called me into increasingly formal meetings, each one colder than the last. They asked for detailed accounts, times, dates, exact words spoken, who else was present. I felt like I was under a microscope, every gesture and choice scrutinized, as though my compassion was a crime rather than a gift. The hospital's lawyers warned the administration that allowing unauthorized interpreting endangered patients' safety and opened the doors to costly lawsuits. HR insisted on enforcing the rules strictly, no exceptions, no sympathy. Yet outside those sterile offices, families like the Herreras faced the brutal reality of language barriers that weren't just inconvenient but deadly. Gossip spread like wildfire among the staff. Some whispered that I was reckless, a rogue element threatening the hospital's reputation. Others quietly rallied, sharing stories of how I'd helped translate during emergencies or defused misunderstandings that could have ended in tragedy. Then came the anonymous complaint. Someone, though no one knew who, reported me for putting patients at risk. Was it jealousy? Fear? I didn't know. But the accusations set the investigation on fire. HR intensified their pressure, dictating that I was to have no contact with patients, families, or even medical staff without supervision. Meanwhile, the Herreras were in crisis. Miguel's condition was worsening. Seizures came more frequently, and doctors recommended surgery to remove a tumor pressing on his brain. The family was terrified, not just of the operation but of being lost in translation again. When I tried to be their advocate from afar, I felt powerless. I called Laura, begging for an exception, for permission to at least sit with the family during critical consultations. Laura's voice was cold, final. "No. You're suspended pending the review. Violating this order could lead to termination." The family didn't accept this. One afternoon, Mrs. Herrera came to the hospital, shaky and tearful, with Miguel's medical paperwork clutched to her chest. She asked the receptionist, "Where is the interpreter who helped us? We want her back. We trust her." That night, in the hospital cafeteria, I met Mrs. Patel from the endocrinology ward. She shared how her husband struggled to understand his diabetes care instructions, how the certified interpreter failed to convey the nuances of their language. "They don't understand our fears, especially older folks," she said. "They need someone who knows their pain." Stories like hers fueled my determination. This wasn't just about me breaking rules. It was about a system failing to meet the human needs of its patients. But HR was unmoved. Then, the meeting came I had dreaded. HR, the legal team, hospital administration, and representatives from medical staff gathered in a windowless room. The Herreras were invited, too, their presence a quiet rebellion in itself. Mr. Herrera took the floor first. With tears in his eyes, he detailed the confusion and fear his family endured without me. She was our voice when we had none, he said. The certified interpreters don't speak our language, they speak words. She speaks our hearts. Mrs. Herrera followed, her voice trembling. When it felt like we were drowning in medical jargon, she was the life raft. Please, keep her. Don't let us lose the only person who understands. Doctors who had interacted with me also spoke up, acknowledging the gap in certified interpreter availability and praising my efforts to bridge it. But Laura remained unmoved. Policies are in place to protect patients and the hospital. Intentions do not excuse violations. The room grew tense. Despite heartfelt testimonies, HR's stance didn't budge. I was suspended indefinitely, and a formal reprimand was placed in my file. Yet, as the door closed behind us, Mr. Herrera whispered, "This isn't over. We trust her." Outside, I felt the weight of that trust and the cold reality that the walls of bureaucracy might be higher than any of us ever imagined. Suspension was a punch to the gut, but the real test was yet to come. Despite HR's orders, the Herreras refused to move forward without me. Every new appointment became a battlefield of wills between the family, hospital staff, and administration. I watched from the sidelines, desperate but powerless. One afternoon, Mrs. Herrera arrived at the hospital with a petition signed by several immigrant families who relied on me as their interpreter. They walked through the corridors, chanting softly in Spanish, "We trust her. She understands us." It was a protest in the face of bureaucracy, a plea for empathy in a system built on rules. The social worker, speaking with sympathetic eyes, confided in me, "You've exposed a real gap in our care. The certified interpreters are swamped, and families aren't getting the support they need." Behind closed doors, HR held emergency meetings. Their dilemma was clear: enforce policy and risk losing patient trust in legal battles, or bend the rules and set a precedent that could spiral. Meanwhile, Miguel's surgery date loomed closer. The family was terrified, clinging to me like I was a lifeline on a stormy sea. Every conversation, every word mattered more than life or death in that context. In a tense meeting with hospital administration, the Herreras attorney laid it out plainly. If you proceed without the trusted interpreter, you risk a cultural negligence suit. The family's refusal to sign consent without her presence is not a refusal of care, but an expression of fear and mistrust. That night, I sat alone in the dim hospital cafeteria, replaying all the moments, the fear in their eyes, the coldness in HR's tone. I was caught between two worlds, the rigid hospital system and the very real lives depending on me. Then came the call from Laura. The suspension was extended indefinitely. She said, "Your presence is causing disruption. Take time to reconsider your position." But the Herreras wouldn't wait. When Miguel's seizures worsened, the family made a last stand. They refused to authorize any procedures unless I was allowed to be present. Pressure from patient advocacy groups and local media started to heat up. A reporter called, wanting my story for the evening news. I hesitated but agreed, wanting the public to know the human cost of HR policies. With eyes everywhere, the hospital relented, but on strict conditions. I would be allowed to interpret only under supervision, with recording and oversight. It was humiliating but necessary to bridge the divide. In the operating room waiting area, as Miguel was prepped for surgery, I held Mrs. Herrera's hand, whispering reassurances in our shared language. The surgery was a success, yet the battle was far from over. The hospital faced a reckoning, staff divided, policies challenged. For the first time, the system was forced to confront its own limitations. I learned then that compassion, trust, and human connection can disrupt even the strongest walls of policy, but it comes at a steep cost. The days after Miguel's surgery were strange, suspended between relief and dread. The tumor had been removed successfully, but the hospital was still reeling from the confrontation that got me back into that operating room. HR made it clear that my supervised return was a one-time exception, not a policy change. I was still suspended, still under investigation, still facing the very real possibility of termination. But something had shifted. The Herreras protest, the family signing petitions, the news coverage, it all created pressure the administration couldn't ignore. Patient advocacy groups started calling, asking pointed questions about language access and cultural competence. One local news anchor ran a segment titled Lost in Translation, When Hospital Rules Fail Immigrant Families, and suddenly St. Michael's was in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. I spent my suspension days at home, staring at my phone, waiting for updates. Mrs. Herrera texted me every few hours with Miguel's progress, his vitals, his pain levels, whether he'd eaten anything. She still needed me, even from a distance. I could feel the weight of that need pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Then, on a Thursday morning 2 weeks after the surgery, everything exploded. Miguel's condition took a sudden turn. His brain swelling increased despite the medication, and the doctors recommended an emergency procedure to relieve the pressure. It was risky, time-sensitive, and required immediate consent from the family. The certified interpreter assigned to the case was stuck in traffic, delayed by at least an hour. The neurosurgeon stood in the hallway outside Miguel's room, trying to explain the urgency through broken Spanish and hand gestures while Mrs. Herrera sobbed, and Mr. Herrera stared blankly, unable to process what was happening. The doctors needed consent now, not in an hour. Someone called me. I don't even know who. Maybe the social worker, maybe one of the nurses who'd seen me with the family before. My phone rang, and a panicked voice said, "We need you here. Miguel's dying, and the family won't sign without understanding what's happening. Please." I should have said no. I was suspended, banned from patient contact, one violation away from being fired. But I heard Mrs. Herrera's voice in the background, wailing my name, and I couldn't stop myself. I drove to the hospital, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, knowing I was about to cross a line I could never uncross. When I walked into Miguel's room, the relief on the Herrera's faces was immediate and heartbreaking. Mr. Herrera grabbed my hand, pulled me close to his son's bedside, and said, "Tell us. Make us understand." I looked at the neurosurgeon, at the nurses hovering nearby, at the clock ticking away precious minutes, and I translated. I explained the procedure, the risks, the alternatives, the consequences of waiting. I watched understanding dawn in their eyes, watched fear turn into clarity, and then I watched them sign the consent form. The surgery saved Miguel's life, but it destroyed mine. HR found out within hours. Laura stormed into the waiting room where I sat with the Herreras, her face rigid with fury. "You were explicitly ordered not to have patient contact," she hissed. "You violated your suspension terms. Consider yourself terminated, effective immediately." The Herreras tried to intervene, tried to explain that I'd saved their son's life, but Laura cut them off. "This isn't about compassion. It's about liability, protocol, and the fact that she has repeatedly disregarded direct orders." She turned to me, her voice cold. "Security will escort you out. You're no longer employed by St. Michael's Hospital." I felt numb walking through those corridors one last time, a security guard trailing behind me like I was a criminal. Nurses I'd worked with for years looked away. Patients I'd helped waved sadly from their doorways. The Herreras followed me all the way to the parking lot, crying, apologizing, promising to fight for me. But I knew it was over. The next morning, the hospital received a letter from the Herreras attorney threatening a lawsuit for cultural negligence and discrimination. They argued that the hospital's failure to provide adequate language services had put Miguel's life at risk, and that my termination was retaliation for exposing systemic failures. Other families joined the complaint: the Nguyen's, the Achebis, the Patels, all citing instances where language barriers had compromised their care. The media picked it up immediately. Suddenly, I wasn't just a fired hospital employee, I was the face of a movement demanding better language access and cultural competency in healthcare. Reporters camped outside my apartment. Advocacy groups asked me to speak at rallies. The hospital's reputation took hit after hit as more stories emerged of families struggling to communicate, of certified interpreters being overbooked or unavailable, of patients making life-or-death decisions without fully understanding what was being asked of them. St. Michael's administration went into crisis mode. They offered me a settlement, a confidentiality agreement, a modest payout, and a promise not to speak publicly about my experience. In exchange, I would drop any potential legal claims and disappear quietly. Laura delivered the offer herself, her tone suggesting it wasn't really a choice. "Take this, move on with your life, and stop making this difficult for everyone," she said. But the Herreras called me that same night. Miguel was awake, recovering, asking for me. "He wants to thank you," Mrs. Herrera said through tears. "You saved him. You saved our family." And I realized that staying silent wasn't just about protecting myself anymore. It was about every family who would come after the Herreras, every person who would struggle to be heard in a system that valued efficiency over empathy. I turned down the settlement. The hospital's response was swift and brutal. They released a statement claiming I'd endangered patients by practicing without proper credentials, that I'd violated protocol repeatedly, and that my termination was justified. They painted me as reckless, unqualified, dangerous. My phone exploded with messages, half supporting me, half condemning me as a liability who'd put ego above patient safety. In the chaos, I found myself sitting in my apartment late at night, staring at a photo of Carlos from years ago, his face thin and tired from treatment. I'd failed him because I couldn't find the words, couldn't bridge the gap between what the doctors said and what my mother needed to hear. And now I'd been punished for refusing to let that happen to anyone else. The irony was crushing. The lawsuit moved forward, slowly grinding through depositions and motions. The Herreras stood firm, refusing to back down even when the hospital's lawyers tried to intimidate them. Other families added their voices, creating a chorus of grievances that couldn't be ignored. And somewhere in the middle of it all, I realized that this fight wasn't just about me anymore. It was about trust, the trust families place in a system that's supposed to care for them, and the trust I'd placed in my own instinct to help, even when the rules said I shouldn't. The lawsuit dragged on for months, turning my life into a series of depositions, legal briefs, and sleepless nights. The Herreras remained steadfast, refusing every settlement offer that didn't include acknowledgement of wrongdoing and systemic change. But the hospital fought back hard, painting me as a rogue employee who prioritized personal relationships over professional standards. Their lawyers dug into every interaction I'd had with patients, searching for mistakes, mistranslations, anything that could prove I was dangerous rather than compassionate. The pressure was unbearable. I couldn't find work. No hospital would hire someone in the middle of a high-profile lawsuit against another institution. My savings drained away paying legal fees. Friends stopped calling, uncomfortable with the controversy. Some days I wondered if the Herreras fight was worth the cost, if maybe I should have just taken the settlement and disappeared. Then came the breakthrough. A group of medical students at NYU, inspired by the news coverage, launched a research project examining interpreter availability at hospitals across New York City. Their findings were damning. Certified interpreters were consistently overbooked by 40 to 60% during peak hours. Families waited an average of 2 to 4 hours for language services during emergencies, and patient outcomes were measurably worse when communication barriers weren't addressed quickly. The study made national headlines, and suddenly St. Michael's wasn't fighting just me. They were fighting documented evidence of systemic failure. Other hospital employees started coming forward with their own stories. A nurse who'd been reprimanded for using a translation app during an emergency. A janitor who'd been suspended for helping a Spanish-speaking patient find the right department. A physician who'd faced HR complaints for allowing family members to translate when no certified interpreter was available. The pattern was clear. Hospitals prioritized liability protection over patient care, and employees who tried to bridge the gap paid the price. The hospital's legal strategy shifted. Instead of attacking me directly, they tried to settle with the Herreras privately, offering a substantial payment in exchange for dropping the cultural negligence claims. But Miguel, now recovered and back in school, refused. He'd become an unexpected voice in the fight, speaking at community meetings about how terrifying it was to see his parents lost and confused while he lay dying. "She didn't just translate words," he told a reporter. "She translated hope." In the midst of all this chaos, I received an unexpected call from the hospital's chief medical officer, Dr. Richard Chen. He'd been largely absent from the controversy, but now he wanted to meet privately. We sat in a coffee shop in Astoria, far from the hospital, and he looked exhausted. "I've been pushing administration to expand interpreter services for 3 years," he said quietly. "Budget cuts always win. Your case has forced conversations we should have had a long time ago, but the board is terrified of the precedent. If they admit fault, every hospital in the city could face similar lawsuits." I asked him what he wanted from me. He leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want you to know that not everyone in that building thinks you're the villain here. Some of us think you exposed a truth we've been ignoring because it's expensive and complicated. But I also need you to understand that if this lawsuit succeeds, there will be real consequences for how healthcare operates in this country. Maybe good ones, maybe terrible ones. Are you prepared for that? I wasn't sure I was. The lawsuit had taken on a life of its own, becoming about policy reform and institutional accountability rather than just my job or the Herreras experience. Advocacy groups were using my story to push for state legislation mandating maximum wait times for interpreter services. Insurance companies were threatening to raise premiums if hospitals faced increased liability for language access failures. The issue had exploded beyond anything I'd imagined when I first walked into room 412 and held Mrs. Herrera's hand. Then came the hearing that changed everything. The Herreras attorney brought in expert witnesses, linguists, healthcare policy researchers, cultural competency specialists, who testified about the gap between legal requirements for language access and actual practice. They presented case studies of patients who'd suffered harm due to communication failures, families who'd made wrong medical decisions because they didn't fully understand their options, and healthcare workers who'd been punished for trying to help. But the most powerful moment came when Mrs. Herrera took the stand. She spoke through an official interpreter this time, her words deliberate and measured. She described watching David die, then nearly losing Miguel, all while feeling invisible in a system that claimed to care for everyone equally. "I am not uneducated," she said, her voice breaking. "I am not stupid. I am someone's mother, someone's wife. And I deserve to understand what is happening to my children." She gave us that dignity. She saw us as human beings, not as a problem to be managed. The judge listened intently, asking few questions but taking extensive notes. When the hearing ended, he promised a decision within 30 days. Those 30 days felt like years. During the wait, the hospital made one final offer. They would create a new position for me, cultural liaison coordinator, with a mandate to work with certified interpreters and help families navigate the system. I would be reinstated with back pay. The lawsuit would be settled with a public acknowledgement of the need for improved language services, and I would become part of the solution rather than the controversy. It was everything I'd fought for except for one thing. I would have to sign a statement saying my previous actions were unauthorized and inappropriate, even if well-intentioned. I sat with that offer for days, torn apart by the choice. Taking it meant validating the system that had punished me, admitting I'd been wrong even though I'd saved lives. Rejecting it meant staying in limbo, fighting a battle that might never end, risking that the judge would side with the hospital anyway. I called Mrs. Herrera. She listened quietly as I explained the offer, then said something I'll never forget. "We did not fight for you to bow your head now. We fought because the system was broken, and you were brave enough to say so. Whatever you decide, we will support, but do not let them make you ashamed of your heart." The judge's decision came on a rainy Thursday morning. He ruled partially in favor of the Herreras, finding that the hospital had failed to provide adequate language services and that this failure constituted a violation of federal civil rights protections. But he stopped short of declaring my termination wrongful, stating that while my intentions were compassionate, the hospital had legitimate concerns about liability and protocol. It was a split decision that satisfied no one completely but forced both sides to reckon with uncomfortable truths. St. Michael's Hospital was ordered to implement sweeping changes, hire additional certified interpreters, create a 24-hour language access hotline, establish cultural competency training for all staff, and form a patient advocacy committee that included community members. The financial penalties were significant, but not devastating. And I was offered reinstatement under the new cultural liaison position, with no requirement to admit wrongdoing. I accepted, not because the fight was over, but because I realized I could do more from inside the system than outside it. Miguel and his family attended my first day back, standing in the lobby as I walked through those doors again, this time with a badge that read Cultural Liaison instead of Supply Coordinator. Mr. Herrera shook my hand and said, "Now you can help everyone. That's all we ever wanted." But the victory felt incomplete. I'd gotten my job back, the hospital had been forced to change, and families would have better access to interpreters. Yet I couldn't shake the memory of standing in that hallway, being escorted out by security, feeling like compassion was a crime. The system had bent, but it hadn't broken. And I knew there were countless other hospitals where the same battle was being fought quietly, invisibly, by people who didn't have lawyers or advocates or headlines pushing for change. As I walked through the hospital that first day back, I passed room 412. A new family was there now, speaking Mandarin, gesturing frantically to a nurse who couldn't understand. I stopped, introduced myself, and called the interpreter hotline. Within 15 minutes, a certified Mandarin interpreter arrived via video call, and I watched the family's faces shift from panic to relief as they finally understood what was happening to their father. It was a small moment, easily overlooked, but it felt like proof that the fight had mattered. Still, I thought about Carlos every single day, about how I'd failed him because I was too young, too overwhelmed, too late, and I realized that maybe I'd been fighting for him all along, trying to rewrite a story I couldn't change, trying to save him by saving everyone else. The Herreras didn't just trust me with their sons' lives. They trusted me with my own grief, giving it purpose and meaning. That was the real gift, the one I'd carry forward no matter what happened next. 6 months into my new role as cultural liaison, I thought I'd found some kind of peace. The hospital had hired 3 additional certified interpreters, implemented the 24-hour language hotline, and mandated quarterly cultural competency training for all staff. On paper, everything had changed. But walking those hallways every day, I saw how slowly real transformation happens, how deeply resistance runs in institutions built on hierarchy and habit. Some doctors embraced the changes, grateful for better communication tools and clearer protocols. Others resented what they saw as bureaucratic overreach, complaining that the new procedures added time to already packed schedules. Nurses were split. Some thanked me privately for making their jobs easier, while others whispered that I'd made everything more complicated, that we'd been fine before all this drama. Laura was still there, still in HR, and we passed each other in corridors with tight smiles and no words. The tension between us was a living thing, a reminder that institutional change doesn't erase personal grudges. She fought the reforms every step of the way, arguing in meetings that the costs outweighed the benefits, that we were solving a problem that didn't exist. But the data proved her wrong. Patient satisfaction scores among non-English-speaking families jumped 17% in the first quarter, readmission rates dropped, and we hadn't faced a single language-related complaint since the new system launched. My days became a blur of hospital rounds, checking in with families who needed cultural support, training staff on how to work effectively with interpreters, and troubleshooting the inevitable problems that came with any new system. I met families from every corner of the world. Haitian immigrants struggling to understand their daughter's leukemia treatment, elderly Chinese patients confused about end-of-life care options, Nigerian mothers terrified by their baby's diagnoses. Each one carried the same fear I'd seen in the Herreras' eyes, the terror of being lost in a system that spoke a language they couldn't decode. But I also saw the limits of what I'd accomplished. The certified interpreters were still overbooked during peak hours. The video interpretation system crashed regularly. Some doctors still tried to use family members as translators to save time, reverting to old habits when no one was watching. And the deeper issues, the cultural assumptions embedded in American healthcare, the power imbalances between providers and immigrant patients, the ways poverty and legal status complicated access to care, those remained largely untouched. The Herreras visited often, bringing me homemade tamales and updates on Miguel's recovery. He'd returned to school, joined the debate team, started talking about becoming a doctor himself. Mrs. Herrera would hug me tightly each time, whispering, "You saved us," and I'd feel the weight of that gratitude pressing down on my chest. Because I knew the truth. I'd saved them, yes, but I hadn't saved the thousands of others who faced the same barriers in hospitals across the city, across the country. The system had bent for the Herreras because they had the strength to fight, the resources to hire lawyers, the courage to stand up publicly. But what about the families who didn't? Who accepted confusion and fear as the price of care because they didn't know they deserved better? One afternoon, I received a call from a hospital in Brooklyn. They'd heard about our language access reforms and wanted to consult on implementing something similar. Then, another call came from a community health center in the Bronx, then a clinic in Newark. Word was spreading, and suddenly I was being asked to speak at conferences, to write articles, to share our model with other institutions. It was flattering, overwhelming, and deeply uncomfortable. I wasn't a policy expert or a healthcare administrator. I was someone who'd held a grieving mother's hand and gotten fired for it. But somehow that story had become bigger than me, a symbol of something people were hungry for, proof that compassion could change systems, that individual acts of courage could force institutions to evolve. Dr. Chin approached me one day in the cafeteria, sitting down across from me with his usual tired smile. "You've become quite the advocate," he said. "I'm hearing your name at board meetings, national healthcare forums. The administration is calling you a success story now, evidence that St. Michael's is leading the way in patient-centered care." There was irony in his voice, and I appreciated it. We both remembered how they'd called me a liability just months earlier, how they'd fought tooth and nail against everything I now represented. "Do you ever wonder if it's enough?" I asked him. "All these changes, all this attention, but I still see families struggling, still hear stories about people getting lost in the system. We fix one hospital. There are thousands more." He nodded slowly. "That's the hard part of systemic change. It's slow, incomplete, messy, but it's also cumulative. Every hospital that adopts a better language access policy, every healthcare worker who learns to recognize cultural barriers, every patient who feels heard and understood, it all adds up. You can't fix everything, but you don't have to. You just have to keep moving the needle forward." His words helped, but they didn't erase the persistent ache I carried. The ache that started with Carlos, that drove me into those hospital rooms against protocol, that nearly destroyed my career and ended up transforming it. I'd spent years trying to save my brother retroactively by saving everyone else, and I was slowly learning that it didn't work that way. Grief doesn't get resolved through proxy. Loss doesn't disappear because you help other people avoid it. One evening, I visited Carlos's grave for the first time in years. I sat on the grass beside his headstone and told him everything. About the Herreras, about Miguel, about the lawsuit and the reinstatement and the reforms. I told him I was sorry I hadn't been there when he died. Sorry I couldn't translate well enough to help him and Mom and Dad navigate the nightmare of his illness. And for the first time, I said out loud what I'd never admitted before, that no amount of helping other families would bring him back, that I had to forgive myself for being 16 and scared and not enough. The next week, I met with a group of medical students who wanted to learn about cultural competency and patient advocacy. They were young, idealistic, eager to change the world. One of them, a first-generation American whose parents were immigrants, asked me, "How do you balance following the rules with doing what's right? What if the system tells you to do something that harms patients?" I thought carefully before answering. The system isn't a monolith. It's made up of people who can change, who can be convinced, who can learn to do better. But you have to pick your battles carefully. Sometimes you break the rules and accept the consequences because someone's life depends on it. Other times, you work within the system to change it from the inside. Both approaches matter. Both are necessary. The trick is knowing which one to use when. Another student asked, "Do you regret what you did? Getting suspended, fighting the hospital, risking everything?" I smiled, thinking of Miguel's laugh, of Mrs. Herrera's hands clasped in prayer, of Mr. Herrera's quiet words. "We trust her." "No," I said. "I don't regret it. But I also don't think everyone should follow my path. It cost me more than I expected, and it almost broke me. You have to decide for yourself what you're willing to risk, what battles you're willing to fight. Just don't let the system convince you that compassion is a liability. It's not. It's the whole point." Months turned into a year. The reforms at St. Michael's held, expanded even, as new administrators saw the value in what we built. Miguel graduated high school and enrolled in community college, planning to study pre-med. The Herreras threw a party, inviting everyone who'd supported them through their nightmare, and I stood in their small apartment in Jackson Heights surrounded by food and music and laughter, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. But I also knew the work was never finished. There would always be more families struggling to communicate, more patients falling through cracks in the system, more healthcare workers torn between protocol and compassion. The fight wasn't over. It would probably never be over. But at least now, I wasn't fighting alone. Late one night, as I finished my shift and walked through the empty hospital corridors, I passed room 412 again. It was dark, the patient discharged, the bed stripped and waiting. I stood in the doorway for a moment, remembering David's quiet voice, Mrs. Herrera's tears, the moment Laura had ordered me to leave and Mr. Herrera had said, "We trust her." That trust had cost me everything and given me everything. It had destroyed one version of my life and created another. I thought about all the rooms like this one, in all the hospitals across all the cities where people were scared and confused and desperate for someone to see them as human. I thought about Carlos, about whether he'd be proud of what I'd done or worried about the price I'd paid. And I realized that maybe both could be true, that the cost was real and the impact was real, that pain and purpose could coexist, that I could carry grief and hope in the same breath. As I walked out into the cold night air, my phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Herrera. "Miguel wants to shadow you at work next week. He says you inspired him to become a doctor who listens. Thank you for never giving up on us." I typed back, "Thank you for never giving up on me." And for the first time since this whole journey began, I felt like maybe I'd finally done enough. Not everything. Not perfectly. But enough to matter. Enough to change lives. Enough to honor the trust people like the Herreras had placed in me when the system told them not to. That had to be enough. 2 years after everything changed, I stood in a conference room at Johns Hopkins Hospital, presenting our language access model to healthcare administrators from across the East Coast. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who'd been fired for unauthorized interpreting was now considered an expert on cultural competency and patient advocacy. But as I clicked through slides showing improved patient outcomes, reduced readmission rates, and higher satisfaction scores, I realized this wasn't really about me anymore. It was about every family who'd ever felt invisible in a hospital, every healthcare worker who'd struggled to help across language barriers, every system that had finally been forced to acknowledge that compassion and protocol didn't have to be enemies. After the presentation, a young nurse approached me, her eyes bright with emotion. "I'm from the Philippines," she said quietly. "Last month, my supervisor reprimanded me for translating for a Tagalog-speaking patient during an emergency. I felt so guilty, like I'd done something wrong by helping. But hearing your story, it makes me feel less alone." I gave her the contact information for our patient advocacy network, told her she wasn't alone, and watched her walk away with something that looked like hope. That moment mattered more than any conference presentation or policy reform. Because real change happens in those small exchanges, when someone realizes they're not crazy for caring, not reckless for putting patients first. The Herreras remained constants in my life. Miguel was now in his second year of college, volunteering at a community health clinic that served immigrant families. He decided to become not just a doctor but a bilingual one, someone who could bridge worlds the way I tried to for his family. Mrs. Herrera texted me photos of him in his volunteer scrubs, her pride radiating through the screen. Mr. Herrera, still a man of few words, sent me a card every year on the anniversary of Miguel's surgery with the same message. "Thank you for seeing us as human." I kept every single one. St. Michael's Hospital continued to evolve. The language access program I'd helped design was now fully integrated with dedicated staff, sustainable funding, and measurable outcomes. Laura had transferred to another hospital, whether by choice or pressure I never asked. Dr. Chin became Chief of Patient Experience, using his position to push for even broader reforms around cultural competency, implicit bias training, and community engagement. The institution that had once fired me for caring too much now marketed itself as a leader in inclusive healthcare. It was progress, even if it was complicated progress. But I knew the work was far from finished. Every week, I heard stories from other hospitals, other cities, other healthcare workers facing the same impossible choice between protocol and humanity. The systemic issues ran deep. Underfunded interpreter services, cultural assumptions baked into medical training, legal fears that prioritize liability over care, immigration policies that made families afraid to seek help. Our victories at St. Michael's were real but fragile, dependent on continued advocacy, sustained funding, and administrators who understood that patient trust wasn't just a nice idea but a medical necessity. I thought about Carlos often, especially on the hard days when progress felt impossibly slow. I'd finally learned to separate my grief for him from my work for others, to understand that helping families like the Herreras didn't erase my failure to save my brother but honored the lesson his death had taught me, that being seen, being heard, being understood in your own language during your most vulnerable moments wasn't a luxury. It was a fundamental human right. And systems that denied that right, no matter how well-intentioned their policies, were failing at the most basic level of care. On the anniversary of my reinstatement, I visited room 4121 last time. A new family was there, Ethiopian immigrants, speaking Amharic, their elderly mother recovering from a stroke. I introduced myself, explained my role, and within minutes had connected them with a certified Amharic interpreter via video call. The family's relief was immediate, their gratitude overwhelming. The daughter grabbed my hand and said, "We've been here 3 days, and this is the first time we've fully understood what the doctors are saying. Thank you for caring." I wanted to tell her that this was what the system was supposed to do, that she shouldn't have to thank me for basic communication. But I also knew that gratitude came from a place of deep vulnerability, and accepting it with grace was part of honoring their experience. As I left the hospital that evening, my phone buzzed with a text from Miguel. "Just got accepted to medical school. None of this would have happened without you. Thank you for fighting for us." I stopped in the parking lot, tears streaming down my face, and typed back, "You did this yourself. I just helped translate." But even as I sent it, I knew it wasn't entirely true. The Herreras had fought for me as hard as I'd fought for them. Their trust had saved me as much as my advocacy had helped them. We pulled each other through a broken system and come out the other side changed, stronger, more certain that compassion wasn't a liability but the whole point. Years from now, someone will ask me if it was worth it. The suspension, the lawsuit, the public scrutiny, the nights I couldn't sleep wondering if I destroyed my career for nothing. And I'll think about David's quiet voice telling me about his dreams, about Mrs. Herrera's hand in mine as she sobbed over her son's diagnosis, about Mr. Herrera standing up to HR and saying, "We trust her. Please keep her." I'll think about Miguel in medical school, about the Ethiopian family finally understanding their mother's care plan, about the hundreds of families who now have access to interpreters because one hospital was forced to change. And I'll say yes, without hesitation, it was worth every single moment. Because trust, once earned, transforms everything. And I'd rather live in a world where trust matters more than protocol, where compassion is valued over efficiency, where being human is never a violation. That's the world the Herreras helped me fight for. That's the world I'll keep building, one translation, one family, one moment of understanding at a time. Some battles you don't choose, they choose you. Mine started in a hospital room with a grieving mother and ended with systemic reforms that will outlive us all. But the real victory wasn't the policy changes or the job reinstatement. It was learning that trust, even when it costs everything, is always worth defending. The Herreras trusted me when the system told them not to, and that trust became the foundation for change that rippled far beyond one family, one hospital, one story. If you've ever felt caught between doing what's right and following the rules, know this: compassion is never a mistake. It might be risky, costly, or complicated, but it's never wrong. And sometimes, the most important thing we can do is simply see another person's humanity and refuse to look away, no matter what the system demands. That's where real healing begins. Have you or someone you know ever faced language barriers in healthcare? Have you witnessed moments when compassion clashed with protocol? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please subscribe to this channel for more real stories about navigating difficult systems, finding courage in impossible moments, and the power of choosing humanity over convenience. Your support helps amplify voices that need to be heard. Thank you for listening.